I'm Mark Volquist, and I'm very pleased to be with you in Hangzhou again. As many of you know, I'm an old friend of the Hangzhou Science and Technology Association, and it's always been a great pleasure to have a conversation with you near Shihu. With Professor Shen Lirong, who has invited me this time, we decided that I might talk with you about an interesting and important question. Who are we? Who do we think we really are? If we understand that, I think we will be more able to address our food and our health problems. I'm going to suggest that we are socio-ecological beings who cook. This may seem a rather strange title, but the word socio-ecological has two parts: socio, which means it has to do with us as members of a community, of a household and a society, and ecological, because I'm going to argue that we are very much parts of our ecosystem. And why cooking? If you think about it, humans are the only animal that cooks. I don't know of any other creature that cooks. When we began to cook, to use fire, to prepare our food, we changed, I think, our biology greatly. The people, the creatures, the beings that we now are socio-ecological, and we cook. And what I'm going to suggest to you today and discuss with you is that if we lose our social connections, if we lose our ecological connections, and we don't continue to prepare our food in a way that we understand and know and enjoy, then that will affect our health. It will certainly affect who we are. Now, this PowerPoint draws attention to an increasing recognition, at least in Asia, that our health depends greatly on our connection with nature. And in Japan, this is referred to as Shinrin Yoku. You can see the Chinese characters there for this concept. It's called forest bathing. And increasingly, as many of you may know, doctors in Japan are suggesting for certain health problems to people that they should be treated by spending more time in nature. And the recommendations are to go to a forest, to walk slowly, to breathe in nature, open all your senses, and that this is a healing way of Shinrin-yoku forest therapy. The medicine is simply being in the forest. And I'm going to suggest to you that part of the reason why nature is so important is that it provides the food system on which we depend, and also provides many aspects of the health system that we need. In studies, not in Asia, but in the UK, in England, when the whole of England has been studied for the relationship between the natural environment and health inequalities, it has been found in this very huge study of 40 million people, almost the entire population of England, that with increasing exposure to green space here along the x-axis, the incidence ratio for all-cause mortality is related, and it's the more exposure to nature, the longer people live. And to put it in another way, populations that are exposed to the greenest environments have the lowest levels, not only of mortality, but also of health inequality related to income deprivation. And it's clear from these studies, at least in England, that physical environments promote good health and might be an important way in which we can actually reduce socioeconomic health inequalities. And this diagram from the same study published in The Lancet shows this point about income, because what it shows is that when the income group improves, changes from 2 to 3 to 4, then all-cause mortality and also deaths from circulatory disease increase. And the interesting thing is that this is related to income deprivation, so that the greatest benefit here in the purple, as exposure to green space along the x-axis improves, the people in the purple bar, they are the ones with the least good income. They get the greatest benefit. And so in England, where, as in many countries, social inequality still exists, the greatest benefit on health is found for the most socioeconomically deprived by increasing exposure to green space. The question is, why is this, and what has food got to do with it? What we've generally thought of, how we've generally thought about food, is that that it provides nutrients, and it does provide nutrients: fat, protein, carbohydrate, water, dietary fiber, and micronutrients, vitamins and minerals. But it's much more than that. I'm going to suggest that the whole food system is important for our health, and that's why our relationship with nature is important. But to take one thing in particular, which is not part of food composition tables, which have the nutrients, even the structure of food is important. And so how we prepare our food, how we process it, how we cook it, coming back to that point, is actually important also for our health. The physical properties of food are important, and so are many other things I'm going to talk about later. Of course, the food is not just the nutrients that we ordinarily think about. There are also a number of other components in food, many of which are called phytonutrients if they come from plants. Phyto means plant. Phytonutrients with bioactive properties, and which are food components, but also important for our health. So at the moment, we have to be, I think, aware that food composition tables and actually many recommendations for our diet are limited because we only think in terms of nutrients. We are not thinking about the whole food system or how it relates to nature. Part of this relationship with nature is us doing things in nature, growing our food through agriculture, obtaining our food through fishing, or simply gardening ourselves. And that may be gardening for food. It may also be gardening for the things that please us, like flowers and beauty. In fact, many years ago, in 1980, we did a study in a city called Geelong in Australia. It's not far from Melbourne. And we found that even small gardens that people kept were associated with better health. And another project that we did in 1992 in the socioeconomically deprived area was that we trained young people, adolescents, to grow food in gardens that were in land that was owned by the government, but not used for any other purpose. And we found that in this district of Broadmeadows in Melbourne, that when young people became involved in developing gardens, the crime rate went down and their health improved. And that study has gone on to become a part of the community, how the community lives and works. So coming back to Hangzhou, as many of you know, I've lived in Hangzhou, and this was at Zhejiang Daxie. This was the view from my balcony. And I must say that it was one of the most beautiful aspects that I ever enjoyed in the Zhejiang Daxie. Actually, the loveliest thing of all for me was that at the August Moon Fest, the moon actually came across here, and actually the reflection of the moon was in this. It was in this small river or stream. It was the most wonderful occasion. And behind here, you will know in Zhejiang Daxie that just nearby here there are community gardens where people grow vegetables and fruits. So it's a good example in my life of how gardens made me feel healthier. And of course, often the way in China is that people do find ways of urban farming, urban gardening, even amongst high-rise buildings. Here are some people gardening. Many of you will be quite familiar with how it's a very Chinese thing to do, to find a way to grow fruit and vegetables and have flowers and beauty wherever you live. So that's, I think, one of the really nice things about China. But it does illustrate, I think, the point that Chinese people understand how important the connection is between us and the environment. Community gardening, as you've seen there in China, it has been studied in the West as well. And here is a study by Hale and others, where they found that community gardens are increasingly praised for their therapeutic qualities to help people get better when they feel unwell. And they think this is because of many inputs: tactile, it means touching, emotion, value-driven responses to the gardening experience, and how these responses influence health at various ecological levels. This is a study of 28 urban gardeners published in this journal here. And they found in this study that the aesthetic experiences of gardeners, positive health outcomes, that getting our hands dirty and growing food meant that people enjoyed their vegetables more and enjoyed what they cooked more, and that the emotional connection with the garden was part of the reason they felt better. So the physical and social qualities of garden participation awaken the senses and stimulate a range of responses that influence interpersonal processes, learning, affirming, and expressive experiences, and often improve social relationships. We often garden together with other people, of course, which is supportive of positive health-related behaviours and overall health. So this is not just an idea. These things have been quite well studied. I can say that my father, who had a Swedish background, he died in his 91st year in his own garden. But I have to say he died in a heat wave when the temperature had been over 40 degrees for 10 days, and he was working in his garden when it was 43 degrees. And he died, I'm sorry to say, my father, of a heat stroke and a heat wave, where I would say he died of climate change. That's the rather sad part about it. Now, I'd like to make the point that the way in which food affects our biology and our health goes all the way, if you like, from the garden to how food is handled when we put it in our mouth and eat it. And this particular study of a colleague of mine, Eric Reynolds from Melbourne University, this is a multi-university study, but it's based in Melbourne University, where I'm speaking from. One of the interesting things that's been found is that one of the organisms in our mouth is called Porphyromonas gingivalis. What they have found is that this organism can be found in our brain, not only in our mouth, in our gut. It is actually a cause of gingivitis. Gingivitis is the point where the teeth meet the gums. It looks as though one possible cause of Alzheimer's disease, that's dementia, may be this particular organism. Because what it does, it produces a substance called gingivain, which is involved in the development of amyloid plaques in the brain. By having good mouth hygiene, by having foods which reduce the likelihood of this organism developing in the mouth, we may actually reduce the risk even of Alzheimer's disease, which is, of course, one of the major causes of dementia and of the burden of disease now in society. I think that this illustrates the point that that food is a lot more than nutrients. Food is also how we eat it, how we prepare it, how we cook it. So another interesting finding is that we generally think about taste recognized in the mouth. I've been speaking about the mouth, how we present food to the mouth, which depends in part on cooking and on food structure, and how that can affect the organisms, the microbiome in our mouth, and in turn, it seems that may even be relevant to brain function and the risk of developing dementia or Alzheimer's disease. Another interesting thing is that we generally think about the tongue and the mouth being a place we experience taste. Those receptors in the tongue are also found elsewhere in the body. What is happening, generally speaking, with our food supply, more so I think in the West Asian or Eastern countries, the bitter taste in food tends to be bred out. What we now know is that these receptors for taste, including bitter, are found in the reproductive tract. So I've been talking about how the microbiome in the mouth is important for our health, even to the extent of placing us at risk of dementia or Alzheimer's disease. Also, the way in which we taste our food, the taste of food, is also important for our general health, because the receptors for taste and for smell are found elsewhere in the body, not just in the mouth and in the olfactory apparatus above our nose. And this example actually comes from investigators who are actually now or were when I was there, Dr. Chiu and others at Zhejiang University. And what they found was that there are receptors for the bitter taste, even in the testis, in the male reproductive organ, the testis, and that, as you can see here, the bitter taste, as you increase bitter taste, so the characteristics of the sperm improve, so that the tendency, as I mentioned a moment ago, for us to breed out the bitter taste of food and to prefer sweeter food means, for men at least, that they have less of these components in food which are relevant to reproductive function. So when we think about food, I think we've had too simple a view of it, how it presents, its structure, its smell, its taste, exposing ourselves to it in nature, and how we cook it are all important. This happens to be my father. I mentioned to you a moment ago that he died just before he turned 91. He enjoyed food greatly, but he loved gardening. My father was actually a company director, but his great love was his garden. And I mentioned a moment ago that in a heat wave, unfortunately, at 43 degrees, working in his garden, he actually had a heat stroke and died of kidney failure. This is my son, Ingmar. Weitze is his Chinese name. His mother is Chinese. He's a doctor. This is our family food, parsley, which has been passed down for generations. And the reason for making this point is that in families, we actually often maintain an interest in particular foods as part of our food culture. In my family, we always grow this parsley, and there's no other parsley like it, like the one that my father grew. And I found that when I was working at Zhejiang University, the students, we had a discussion with the students the first year I was there about what they missed most, and it was home cooking. And it was not just home cooking, it was their mother's cooking, so that the food actually reminded them of their mother. And I must say, this particular parsley reminds me of my father. But these things can be passed down. These preferences for taste can be passed down through epigenetic and maybe even microbiomic means. I'll come back to that. In the new edition of my textbook here, first came out in 1981, it's been out for nearly 40 years, Food and Nutrition. Now I have a colleague, Danielle Gallegos, as a co-editor of the book. Many of you will know that the International Union of Nutrition Sciences has recommended that nutrition science be seen in 4 parts: the biological, the biomedical, the part that we're particularly accustomed to, how nutrition relates to our health, but also societal. As I was saying, we are social creatures, environmental, and economic. So food has all of these aspects to it. Here we are in the middle. And who we are depends on all of these four domains. And so that we are not who we often think we are, that we stand alone as individuals. We are very connected to our environment. In fact, we are part of our environment, society. Of course, we're biological, and we are very much dependent on economics. So that's who we are. And so this links us to the planet, from planet to community or society to the household. We often talk about, in English language, the hearth. The hearth is the place where we cook our food and eat together. It's the place we eat together. So our household generally has a hearth, a home and hearth we talk about. So we are, in fact, socio-ecological individuals. I think that is very different to what we've been thinking about as having evolved as individuals. I mean, that is the Darwinian idea of evolution, which was a wonderful appreciation by Charles Darwin and also by Wallace. But I think it's limited in this concept because we haven't evolved as individuals. We have evolved as ecological beings, as socio-ecological beings. And we're not so much individuals, but we're a part of nature. So I'd like to explain this a little more. In this new edition of my book, my textbook, we talk about nutritional biology as it's connected, as it connects us to nature, to ecosystems. For example, sensing systems. A little while ago, we were talking about how taste actually connects us to our food and to plants and to the environment. And so does smell. If we take a walk in the forest, we smell the compounds which are produced by the plants and trees. And there is some really interesting work now on the way in which walking in the forest improves our health. For example, many trees produce aromas, smells, which when we inhale them, they lower our blood pressure, they reduce our blood sugar, they have a favorable effect on our blood fats. To think that simply by regularly walking in nature, we can improve our cardiovascular risk, not just because the walk improves our cardiac function, our heart function, we get a better stroke volume, our heart works better as a pump, but also other aspects of our risk for cardiovascular disease, for diabetes, are modified by the very smells that we acquire from the forest. So they are just a few examples of how we taste, how we hear, what we see, what we touch, and what we smell are part of our nutritional biology. The most obvious thing perhaps is that we acquire in our food energy, kilojoules, calories. By being physically active, we achieve energy balance, and we achieve a favorable body composition. So again, the relationship between us and the environment through physical activity is part of our biology. Yes, we do have DNA and we have a genome. Genome is not only located, of course, in our DNA, it's also located in our RNA, our microRNA, and the way in which our genes express themselves, we now know, and you will know this well by now, depends on epigenetics. Our environment can modify the expression of our genes, and actually that can be passed on from generation to generation. So whereas we used to think rather simply that genetics were simply related to DNA, it's much more than that. And the surveillance of our whole genome is much more complex, and we can't explain that just by selected genes. And now, of course, we know that there's a much bigger genome as part of various microbiomes. The biggest of them, I guess, is in the gut, but in the reproductive system, in the respiratory system, in our mouth, and so on. And our microbiomic genome is many times that of DNA. So we are also prokaryotic and not just eukaryotic. And so our microbiomics also connects us to nature, because there's no clear separation between the microbial world outside of us and that inside. It's a continuum. So each of these things I've mentioned connects us to nature. And so, of course, the gut microbiome is part of our gut. Food is ingested. And of course, if there's anything that connects us with the environment, it's our food system and the way in which our food is digested, absorbed, and metabolized. Very relevant to what we're now encountering with the pandemic of coronavirus, of course. Our body has nature modulates our immune system and the inflammatory response we have to insults to our body. At the moment, to take the example of coronavirus, we don't yet have a vaccine. We don't yet have reliable and safe therapies, ways of stopping the virus from transmitting or affecting us. And so we depend on our innate, INNATE immunity. And that innate immunity depends very much on our environment, on what we eat, on how we exercise, on our diurnal rhythm, sunlight exposure, for example, stimulating the formation of vitamin D, but it's more than that, and our biorhythms. Our homeostasis is what provides a constant internal environment. pH, for example, hydrogen ion concentration is tightly regulated. Certain nutrient concentrations are tightly regulated. Osmolality is tightly regulated. And again, that regulation is achieved in the face of all sorts of inputs from our environment. It is quite remarkable. Temperature is another part of that, of course. And so also is the ability to engage in rhythms across the 24-hour period and from month to month. There's, maybe the ancient ideas in Chinese culture about our relationship to the cosmos also, I think we'll ultimately learn more about. But certainly we have mechanisms for allowing us to synchronize and coordinate our biology with the world around us, with night and day, with the sun and the moon and so on. It's quite remarkable, but we can't really think of ourselves without nature in any one of these areas of nutritional biology. So the way we've now begun to think about and learn about nutrition is more to do with these sorts of domains. Several years ago, my colleague Ray Speck, who is a botanist, ecologist, and mathematician, he is well known for his studies of Gondwana land, the ancient link between the South America, Australia, and Africa. There used to be one big continent called Gondwana land, and there's a lot of similarities in the ecosystems across those three continents. If you regard Australia as a continent, it's the smallest continent, the biggest island. From that, we actually argued that the biodiversity, we depend heavily on maintaining the biodiversity in all of these localities to survive. And that biodiversity is necessary if we're going to have food variety. And we know now, in every set of dietary guidelines, after breastfeeding, the number one, breast milk is remarkable because we can live on breast milk alone, at least when we're babies. But thereafter, the optimal diet is one which is biodiverse and varied. Different sorts of foods are necessary for optimal health. And because all of this depends on, if you like, on the ecosystem in which we live or trade, we argued that we needed to think about our nutrition in ecological terms, and we referred to this as eco-nutrition. The rationale for eco-nutrition is that it captures the notion that nutritionally related health, or NRH, is environmentally dependent. It underscores the link between dietary diversity and biodiversity. It emphasizes the buffer and resilience that the environment provides. It reflects the broader socio-ecological role of food systems beyond the immediate biomedical. And it indicates that being synchronous or harmonious with nature is a marker of our health. And if we are not synchronous with nature, then we tend to become ill There are many examples of how this dietary diversity is important, and I just give you one here to begin with. It's a study we did, a 10-year study in Taiwan, a representative study of the entire population, and we found that if people had a more diverse diet, the greater the diversity, expressed here in a score up to 6, generally speak, that this was related to mortality. This is the hazard ratio here, and was in turn dependent, and this related to the proneness to make errors in cognitive errors. So what we've got here is an example of food diversity allowing us, our brains to work better, to perform better with, as far as cognition or cognitive function is concerned. And that's part of the way in which we reduce our mortality. And there are many examples of this. Almost every area of human health that we look at is of this kind, that dietary diversity confers health advantage. One thing we have to say, interestingly, though, is that this seems to be, it must be important at all ages, but it is interesting that we do start life with breast milk, which is only one food. And actually, in childhood, we seem to manage to get away from time to time with less diversity, as long as children play and are very active. And the point about that is that if you are very physically active, then you have to eat more. And by eating more, then you get enough of the things that you need. So that it tends to be that as we get older, we exercise less. And when we exercise less, we can't eat as much without getting fat. And so therefore, we become more and more dependent as we get older on dietary diversity. So that's something that we're beginning to understand. So if you think about this, what we also found is that, in fact, the very first study I did on dietary diversity was in Melbourne, where we looked at dietary diversity and disease of arteries in people with diabetes. And what we found was that even the earliest signs of diabetes were associated with disease of arteries, atherosclerosis. And we could measure this non-invasively with techniques like compliance. And what we found was that even if people had diabetes, that the more diverse the diet, the less damage there was to their arteries. This, what I've just showed you, that diversity also protects the brain, it also protects arteries. And so, I mean, one of the causes of dementia is actually also cardiovascular disease, atherosclerosis and thrombosis affecting the vascular system. And so what we know is that dietary diversity also reduces the adverse effects of diabetes. Now, think about this. When you develop diabetes, and these are large studies on 500,000 people, when you develop diabetes and you have Chinese ancestry, you're more likely to have dementia, you're more likely to get Parkinson's disease, and you're more likely to be depressed, have an affective disorder. And in fact, the risk is increased up to 2 to 3-fold. So that if it's possible with diet and dietary diversity to reduce the risk of diabetes, then also you'll reduce the risk of all of these neurological problems. So we're beginning to see that even dietary diversity is related to neurodegeneration. And I showed you at the beginning of this talk that the way we eat, and indeed the sort of diversity which gives you more whole grain, structured food, plant food to chew in your mouth, then the organisms in your mouth will be less pathogenic, and that might be another way, other than through your arteries, that you reduce the risk of dementia. So what we're seeing is a picture which links us more and more to nature, the way we eat, biodiversity, and our health. And yet, we are losing diversity. This is an American study of how 100 years ago, these were the varieties there were of vegetables in the United States. Lettuce, for example, 497 varieties. But 100 years later, if you take this down here, track down here, there are only 36 left. Take tomatoes, even tomatoes, which was a foreign vegetable in China, fanchi. So it wasn't always a Chinese vegetable, but is these days. 408 varieties and now only 79. Cucumbers, 285, down to 16. And so it goes on. Cabbage, 544, down to 28. So do you think this matters, that we're losing all of this diversity? Well, from what I've said about just the taste alone is important for our reproductive health, you can see that this almost certainly matters. And the question is, how far are we going to go? How little diversity will we ultimately have in our diet? Then what does that mean for our health? Well, we can also say this back to our sociology, the community in which we live. Here in Australia, those early studies I showed you about public open space, green space in England, it also applies to a very large study in Perth in Western Australia, where the relationship between open space, access to open space in Perth as the capital of Western Australia, was very related to psychosocial distress and mental health. So from a mental health perspective, public open space, POS, quality, within a neighbourhood appears to be more important than the quantity. So it's not just how much you've got, but the quality. And that probably means, for example, not just flat land, but also trees and flowers and food plants and so on. So, but this study for the whole of the Perth population, about 1 million people in Australia, shows how important it is for us in planning our towns, our neighbourhoods, to have public open space. It's come to the point where some people in the healthcare system are now talking about nature deficit disorders. If we don't have enough of nature, if we don't have public open space, we are not as well. This is a term which has been coined by an American writer who wrote a book called The Last Child in the Woods, which was the story of ultimately children without nature become lost and don't survive. It's a rather grim story, but that's where this author coined the term nature deficit disorder. But it is now talked increasingly about in relation to health and the healthcare system in at least in Western society. But I think that is something that's readily understood in Asian communities, and certainly in China. So that's the concept, and it's not yet recognized by the World Health Organization as a part of the classification of disease or of psychiatric or mental health disorders, ICD-10 or DSM-5, but it is meant to serve as a description of the human costs of alienation from the natural world. Its causes may include parental fears, restricted access to nature, and the lure of too much time on screen. Because the more time you spend on the screen, I guess the less time you've got to be in nature. And there was a study in the United States which showed that the decline in people visiting United States national parks was linked to increasing consumption of electronic media by American children. Well, I showed you how much I appreciated my little bridge and garden in Zhejiang Daxie. Here it is again. But these two workers, a geographer called Chuan Yifu and a philosopher, Australian philosopher called Glenn Ulbricht, actually have talked about topophilia, the love of place. Philia means love of a place, and solastalgia, which they say is a form of psychic or mental health disorder caused by environmental loss. And I certainly miss my little bridge, and that's when it was snowing in Hangzhou. But this study done by this worker, Ulbricht, the same Glenn Ulbricht here, published in Psychiatry, or Australasian Psychiatry. This is a district of New South Wales, north of Sydney, where there's a lot of coal mining and power stations. And this study showed that when people lost their outlook on the environment and replaced by this, people became unwell. They use this term in the Hunter Valley in coal mining and power stations in northwest of Sydney. to describe the distress caused by environmental change. Well, we know that physical activity can offset a lot of our health problems. And this particular study published in The Lancet by Wenqi Bang on 500,000 Taiwanese selected as a representative sample of the population showed that even a little bit of physical activity here, increase in daily physical activity, is associated with a reduction in mortality. Even 15 minutes a day was enough to cause a reduction in all-cause mortality. When the more vigorous it was, or the longer it was, up to a certain plateau, you don't get much more after than about, maybe 60 minutes a day. But the impacts on health, the paper published in The Lancet shows its effects on diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and cancer. And even if people already have these disorders, their life can be prolonged by engaging in physical activity. And from what I've said, you can appreciate that some of this might be because when people are physically active, they have access to nature. We don't have enough information at the moment to know whether if you did the exercise in a gym, for example, that's as good as going for a walk in the forest or along the beach or something like that. Anyhow, I think we're at the point where we can talk about getting energy regulation right. And I think it could be summarized like this. Exercise or energy expender, it should be a combination of not being sedentary. Sedentary means sitting down, because we know that even sitting itself is a risk factor for mortality. It isn't just what you do, but it's also what you don't do. And you can avoid being sedentary, of course, by being physically active. But sitting down all day is a problem in itself. So no greater energy intake than that would allow. Well, the point about physical activity is that really sets the limits on how much energy you can consume or eat. As I said earlier, children tend to be more active, and then they can eat relatively more on a body mass basis than an adult. So the thing is, when we become adults, we need to keep being physically active. Exercise can play a major role in reducing disability. It isn't just about living longer, it's reducing disability and living longer. It's best achieved by walking most days for not less than 15 minutes, and ideally 30 to 40 minutes at moderate pace, and by undertaking resistance exercise, where you push and shove, and like gardening or cycling or swimming 2 or 3 times a week. So doing that is about the best thing you can do for your health, other than not smoking, of course. Smoking is the worst thing you can do for your health. And if you exercise in this way, then you can eat more and choose a variety of foods. So optimal health comes from being physically active and having a biodiverse diet. Now, I mentioned earlier that we can pass on, not just through our DNA, but also through our microbiome and epigenetics, we can pass on the things that we do, for good or bad, to our children. So as a grandfather, which I now am, the way I have lived has relevance for my grandchildren. That's sobering to think, isn't it? Even my taste preferences will have affected the spermatogenesis, my reproductive potential, ultimately my children's health, my grandchildren's health as well. And here it shows that how the mother's microbiome in her reproductive tract is passed on to the infant. Whether the baby is born by vaginal means or by a hysterectomy matters, because if the baby is born by hysterectomy, the baby doesn't acquire its mother's reproductive microbiome. And this is one study which shows that this millions of years of coevolution in early life between mother and child are lost with a C-section. Probably can be recovered in various ways, but that this is one factor in increasing the risk of asthma. I won't go into this in detail, but I have said earlier in this that increasingly, I think, to minimize the effects of novel infections like the pandemics we have now with coronavirus, we need to build up our innate, INNATE, immune system. that probably does depend on the way we develop our microbiota, the way in which our natural environment affects, the diversity, I should say, of our microbiota seems to be a good marker of how healthy it is, and that in itself influences the rest of our biology. The nature of our microbiota also depends to the extent to which we have moved from being rural to urban and on crowding. So it's complex, and we've still got a lot to learn about our microbiota, but increasingly I think it's becoming clear that is part of our innate immunity before we learn about the particular infection and develop specific antibodies or T cells, our cellular immunity. And I think that it is worthwhile our thinking about the ongoing importance to us of agriculture against what I've been saying about nature. When people are still involved in food production, in family farming, for example, we are more likely to still retain this health advantage. Now, of course, there are certain unhealthy things about, I suppose, being a farmer, but, if we're exposed to pesticides and things like that. But the interesting thing is that actually still around the world, this was a German study, as I recall, shows that between 35 and 60% of our food supply still comes within 20 kilometers of the urban environment. So peri-urban agriculture is still important. And I know that one of the things when I was working with the Zhu Yongguan in Xiamen at the Institute for Urban Development in China, we had a great interest in how urbanization could retain the advantages of the rural sector and the extent to which food production could continue with urbanization in China. And it's one reason for me showing that picture that earlier of the way in China there is a kind of Chinese enthusiasm for developing gardens wherever people live, including in cities. And of course, not to do so, having crowding even in agriculture, means the emergence of infections like it does in us, in humans. And that has been one reason why we have seen an increase in antibiotic resistance, where just for a very small advantage, antibiotics are used to increase the flesh of, say, pigs or other animals in animal production. We only get about an increase of no more than 2 or 3% in flesh production by the use of antibiotics in animal production. And for that, we get a huge increase in the risk of antibiotic-resistant genes. This is a study from Guangdong province, but I know that Zhu Yongguan has published the studies. This is published in the Lancet. But Yongguan's studies show that I think something like 40% or so of pigs in China have antibiotic-resistant genes. Multiple, not just MCR, multiple antibiotic-resistant genes. That's a problem that we can do without. If we aim for a diversity rather than crowding, single species, single kinds of crops, better to have diversity. And that we get through traditional farming. I know there are some disadvantages in it, but we have to weigh up the disadvantages with the advantages. And this is what's happening with antibiotic-resistant genes around the world. They are becoming a problem globally. And so we're at the point, we've only got 2 or 3 antibiotics which can deal with many diseases now, because so many bacteria have become resistant to the antibiotics that we do have. That's within my lifetime as a medical practitioner. Florey, who was the co-discoverer of penicillin, was one of my mentors, and he and Fleming warned that we had to be careful how we used antibiotics unless this problem would develop. We can't but help talk about poverty and hunger. I guess globally that still is the major health problem, but the challenge we have is that we're very dependent on staples when we have limited food production and food supply. By staple, we mean where we get most of our calories or energy from, be it rice or wheat or maize or millet or whatever. We are living longer, and part of it, I think if you look carefully at it, is that for many of us, we have been able to increasingly diversify our diet, and that's produced a better quality diet. But nevertheless, the problem we have is that most of the world will probably still have to depend on getting most of their calories from just one or two sources. It's a difficult ethical dilemma. It's a dilemma about equity, about who gets the food, who gets the diversity. So it's all very well for people like me to say that's the optimal diet, but the question is, can everyone get it? Well, the problem is that there are, I guess, just too many of us. When the last pandemic beset the world, so-called Spanish influenza, 1918, 1920, the world population was 1.8 billion. And we think that about 50 million people died. And now it's 7.5 billion, the world population. And we've already lost 1 million or so people to the coronavirus, which is pretty terrible. But I think that compared with the Spanish flu, there was even more devastating. No reason not to be concerned about the present problem, but I think that we do have to see the link between, if you like, overpopulation on the one hand and the quality of the food supply on the other. So one of the difficulties about increased population is that we are losing our ecosystems because we chop down the forest, we take away the ecosystems and build factories and houses and what have you in place of them. So finding a way in which we can manage this kind of global population and not suffer more ecosystem loss is increasingly important. But unfortunately, as the global population increases, the numbers of impoverished and hungry rise disproportionately, and the ecosystems on which we depend are lost or become dysfunctional with asymptotic speed. Asymptotic means increasingly fast. We now live in what we can say is the Anthropocene era. Anthropos means humans or people, and this is what we can talk about an era when we're beginning to change the geology of the earth by the way in which we live. And it's reached the point where we have so changed the ecosystems that we live in a new era. And this began at the Industrial Revolution, which largely was in England in 1750 or middle of the 1700s. And in that time, you can see that this is what we've lost in terms of terrestrial ecosystems, of global biodiversity, of ocean ecosystems. No matter what you look at, the pace of ecological change is increasing. And unless we stop it, we are destroying ourselves. The point that I was making about us as ecological creatures is CO2. This isn't just an ocean ecosystem. That's part of us. We are dependent on it. That's who we are. Like the things that we're doing, like the use of water, fertilizer, paper consumption, McDonald's restaurants, motor vehicles, telephones, international tourism. These are all the sort of things that are compromising our ecosystems, making them dysfunctional and ultimately damaging us. So we need, people talk about the need for growth. Well, what is growth? If it means increasing environmental cost, then we don't want it. We have to have growth without environmental destruction. The growth that we so espouse or welcome cannot come at an even greater environmental cost, because ultimately we will destroy ourselves otherwise. And you can see the beginnings of this in the United States, because Dieter and Case got the Nobel Prize about 5 years ago by noticing that middle-class Americans were no longer increasing their life expectancy and actually by now beginning to decrease life expectancy. And they, in their Nobel Prize winning work, they actually showed that many systemic and environmental factors are likely at work behind these mortality trends in the United States, including unstable and low-paying jobs, a fraying social safety network, and other stressors. When life conditions undermine health or one's ability to make healthy choices, we all suffer. So that was summarized for them, but that's their work by Aaron and others. So they saw a connection. Very interesting that they didn't come from the health sector. They were economists. And yet they drew attention to what we in the health sector were missing, this relationship between social and environmental factors and health outcome. What we clearly need to focus on is livelihoods, the things that are basic to our life. And the United Nations system actually makes this point. Livelihoods include having a roof over our head, shelter, clothing, food, education, health and hygiene, communication, transport, child rearing and care. These are the basic things that we need. And more than that is generally an environmental cost. So I would argue that more and more we should be focusing on livelihoods and how we can achieve that through common purpose. And that will include health promoting ecosystems. So it's not so much, I think, about employment. It's more about how we use the resources we've got together. And Östrom, another Nobel Prize winner of the last few years, talked about the commons. And actually people do, by and large, find ways in which they can cooperate together to achieve all of these things. And she figured out that that was a way that people really preferred to go. I guess some people don't, but enough people do. And for that, I think she was the first woman to get the Nobel Prize in economics for that analysis. And believe it or not, that was actually in the United States, which tends to focus very much on individuals rather than the collective society. So I would say that one reason why we have not personally and collectively grappled with the menacing trajectory of population environmental mismatch is that we have not understood how ecological we are. And that depends on us having an understanding of our locality, our environment, whether it be animate, having a life, or inanimate. Even the rocks and things that apparently don't have life, they have an aesthetic value. They're about the seasons, the weather. But all of these things, animate as they are about our locality, our biorhythms, night and day, as I mentioned earlier, genomic convergence and cooperativity, energy regulation, locomotion. That's part of our energy acquisition and utilization, moving from one place to another. Sensory inputs, taste, smell, so on. Hormonal and other homeostatic mechanisms. Back to our nutritional biology, microbiomic pathways, other immune processes, and food systems as part of, ultimately, of our biology. So that's how our nutritional biology comes together. And so we have been involved, I think, in an ecological evolution and not simply a species evolution, as Darwin argued. I admire Darwin for developing with Wallace the understanding of evolution. But I think it's more than that we've been undergoing ecological evolution. And I think the work of Lynn Margulis, who was in Massachusetts Institute of Technology, she never got the Nobel Prize, but I think she should have, because she actually developed the concept of endosymbiosis, that the subcellular particles in our cells originally came from other parts of nature, like viruses and the microbial world. So across the spectrum of macroecology to cellular endosymbiosis, that we go to subcellular particles, as proposed by Lynn Margulis, we have evolved as ecological beings and not as discrete individuals or a species. And once we understand that, we realize that we have to look after our environment, otherwise we will ultimately fail. I mentioned Ju Yongguan. He has actually published some very nice data to show that at a molecular level, there are parts of our molecular biology which are changing in response to the environment and actually acquiring characteristics representing anthropogenic or human-caused pollution in what are called the integrons. And so what he's been interested in doing is measuring at the sort of molecular level changes which represent environmental, the way in which we are responding to our environment. And likewise, exosomes, which are packages of information which cells produce, also can explain whole areas of bodily function being released from cells. And actually what is not shown here, but I've become aware through chairing the research committee of the Rooted Institute in New Zealand, human breast milk also has exosomes, so that genetic material and packages of metabolic information can be passed even from the mother to the baby in breast milk So another way to pass intergenerationally from one generation to the next the experience and environmental exposure of a mother, in this case, to her baby. But here it's within the same generation, how the way cells can gather together information in one part of the body to affect another. So these are profound shifts in our understanding of human biology, which have nutritional inputs. And so, I mean, we may then have a phenotype which changes as we get older, but much of this is actually still a reflection of earlier intergenerational exposure, how ultimately we perform and look as we age. And some people have called this the exosome. So our ecosystem resilience and health, or our reduced capacity to respond, we have to be sure that we don't compromise it anymore, and that we are aware of population vulnerability, which is increased through displacement with conflict, natural disaster, and aging demography. So preserving our ecobiology is getting quite critical. And what I've suggested is that we have to rethink our understanding of human disease and think about much of the way in which we become unhealthy as being ecosystem related, as ecosystem health disorders. So we might usefully add to our diagnostic and management repertoire ecosystem health disorders, EHD. And this is a photograph I took in Yunnan, the stone forest so-called, because I wanted to make the point that it is about things inanimate without apparent life that influences our health. Our synchrony and our order with nature, if we lose even this, every time we are more likely to develop ecosystem health disorders, like I've explained to you earlier. The manifestations of ecosystem disequilibrium could be these: energy dysregulation, body composition disorders, food intake quality disorders, like ultra-processing of food, endocrine problems, sensory input disorders, microbiomic disorders in the gut. But also, there's a link between the microbiome and the brains. So I explained to you neuroregulatory, reproductive, metabolic, biorhythm disorders, disorders of sleep, of eating patterns, contaminant disorders, plastics, endocrine disruptors as they are. And I'm going to say a word or two about that. So if we think about ecosystem disorders, we can, over here, we can, on the right-hand side, we can talk about compromised survival. That is contributed to by protein energy malnutrition or food component deficiencies, body compositional disorders, infection, inflammatory disorders, neoplasia, that's cancer, degenerative disorders, mental health, all together, usually more than one interacting with each other, producing compromised survival, which is multi-organ failure, usually that finally kills us. And if you go back one step further, this is our burden of disease here, eco-health and eco-nutrition. And contributing to all of that is mainly ecosystem degradation and loss of dietary diversity, but it's also food insecurity, energy dysregulation, degraded value systems, non-sustainable livelihoods, inequity, dysfunctional communities. That's not perfect and it's not complete, but it shows you how we can think differently, and I think more constructively and in a problem-solving way, why we are where we are with our biology, about who we are and who we must avoid becoming. And food systems are a big part of it. Present and future food systems, from production to consumption, are championed as ones which are amenable to technological remedy, improvement and sufficiency. Yes, we do think that way, and there's a lot we can do about our present and future food systems. But I think we must be aware that food systems are part of broader systems in nature. What we ultimately find, as we have in representative samples of the Taiwanese population, and there are emerging data in mainland China to show the same thing, the wider the diversity in the diet, the longer we live. This is work by Li Meishuang. You might say, well, what about particular foods? Well, what I haven't put here is that, and that actually we published actually with Zhejiang University a really important paper showing that legumes, beans, are a really important part of the human diet. every food culture on the earth has legumes as part of the diet. It could be soybeans in China, or chickpeas in the Mediterranean, or lentils in South Asia, or brown beans in Sweden, or whatever. We do know from international studies in which I've been involved that legumes or beans always confer some health advantage for survival, less diabetes, less cardiovascular disease. But when it comes to things like dairy, it's a very interesting question about just how universal that is, because as you probably know, only about 15% of the world's population regularly consume dairy, and Chinese people don't usually, although that is changing. It is interesting that we have found in people of Chinese ancestry, even a little bit, less than one serve of dairy a day, less than one serve, appears to reduce the major disease burden of stroke amongst Chinese. And so people talk about lactose intolerance. I think that is not the way to think about it. I think that if lactose, which is milk sugar, survives to the large intestine for fermentation, that's actually an advantage. And so we can talk about lactase non-persisters, where the enzyme lactase does not persist into adult life. And then it's better to talk about lactose nutrition, because lactose then, although not broken down and absorbed in the small intestine, is actually fermented and changes the microbiome in the large intestine to advantage, I think all the evidence would suggest. We can think about dairy in a rather different way to the way in which we used to think about it. And it looks as though, even though it's not generally part of Chinese food culture, it may actually confer some advantage. But I'm not going to make such a strong point about it, except to say, of course, that stroke is one of the biggest biggest contributors to premature death and disability amongst Chinese people. So why is food diversity important? It's more sustainable, provides food quality, provides alternatives. So if you don't have apples, then you can have something else. We are omnivorous with a plant food orientation in our diet. If we have a diverse diet, it's more likely to be micronutrient adequate. It has the dilutional effect that then it dilutes out the toxicants and contaminants, whether it happens to be melamine or endocrine disruptors. It favors energy regulation. It favorably predicts health outcomes. And also, from the point of view of the United Nations and FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, it is a measure of household and personal food security. So that's why food diversity is important. And what about people? You can't have food without people, and yet we are seeing now increasingly systems which are selling food by vendor without people. And I have to say that there's a lot of evidence that the social role of food is important. Eating together is important. Difficult when we have to be socially isolated because of a virus. But actually, we do have to look at ways in which we can keep doing things together. That's who we are. Shopping. If we shop, we live longer. And coming back to cooking, which is where I started, we've shown that if you cook up to 5 times a week, you increase your survival. We don't know whether it's cause and effect, but certainly those who do cook more seem to make better decisions about their food, and they live longer. So cooking, we wouldn't be humans unless we cooked. That's how we are most different, I guess, to animals. So let's cook. And we also know that from an economic point of view, if you spend more money on fruits and vegetables, and less on animal-derived foods, not only do you live longer, but you decrease medical services and lower medical costs. So in Taiwan, we figured out there would be huge savings to the healthcare system if people change their diet a little bit more in the direction of fruits and vegetables. And plastic, well, unfortunately, it's all over the world now in these 5 gyres: North Pacific, South Pacific, Indian Ocean, North Atlantic, and South Atlantic. The plastic is accumulating in these 5 areas, and there's now not a single fish in the oceans that is not without plastic contamination as microplastic or nanoplastic. This is a major, major health problem. It's one of the newly emerging health problems, and we are simply going to have to stop. It's all the way through the food chain, the plastic wrapping on food, all the way through to the biggest of fish. And as I say, there's virtually no fish now that doesn't have plastic, no matter whether you catch it on the coast or fish it from some, or get it from some deep sea fishing vessel. And we don't need plastic bottles. We should be eating apples from the tree and not apple juice. We know that apples protect you against diabetes. Apple juice increases the risk of diabetes. And it's not just that you need the structure of the food, you don't want the plastic. The value of Chinese culture is that people actually had tea, which is health protective, out of a ceramic cup and not out of a plastic bottle. So, it's very important that Chinese culture does not lose some of its healthy practices. Tea was the second most commonly consumed beverage on earth. Maybe coffee is catching up, after water. But hot water meant it was safe, microbiologically safe. So it was a very clever development in Chinese culture to have tea. It was hot, boiled water, microbiologically safe. And it wasn't just the tea, but it was the tea in a ceramic cup, which is much safer than a plastic bottle. And, we need to look after our water supply and not contaminate it with plastic. It's becoming exhausted, our groundwater supply. And the Chinese Academy of Science estimated, must be about 4 years ago now, that all the major Asian rivers were drying up from the Tibetan Plateau, and that 2 billion people in Asia were at risk of no water. No water, no food within one generation. Together with the fact that a lot of the fresh water in China is already non-potable because of contamination. And the rivers coming from the Tibetan Plateau, all of these to Pakistan, to India, to Burma, to Indochina, Yangtze, Huanghe, all of these rivers are beginning to dry up. Why? Because of climate change, global warming, and as the Chinese Academy of Science pointed out, that because as the snow melts, there's not as much reflected heat, the rate of melt of the glaciers in Tibet is increasing. And as that happens, then all of these rivers are drying up. And that by 2030, already 2 billion people will be at risk of inadequate water. By 2050, no water, no food. Same is true of the groundwater drying up. These are infrared pictures over northern India. So it's not just the surface water, it's groundwater as well. And as the ice melts, so the sea level rises and superstorms increase. So it's the loss of water in the major rivers, and it's also the sea rising at the same time. And it's now, this is a very important paper showing how that increases the risk of superstorms and, of course, damage too. And China is, of course, experiencing problems with floods at the moment. So on the one hand, we have drought, on the other hand, we have floods. Australia also has these problems. Australia also has these terrible bushfires. So destroying much of our environment, and animals lost, 1 billion animals or something in Australia with the last bushfires. Simply awful. So food and health systems have an ecological intersection. The ecological intersection of food and health systems is of critical importance in a world where access to both food and health is at risk as our ecology is increasingly threatened. The temperature is rising and it's affecting us in more ways than we care. This is how it's gone up since 1900, the moving average global temperature. And one thing that we've only just recently begun to appreciate is that as temperature goes up, also the insulin receptor binding changes, and we increase insulin resistance. So we hadn't thought about that, but I mean, it's difficult enough now with the increase in problems in diabetes, but if an increase in global temperature also increases insulin resistance, we have yet another problem to deal with. Climate change is affecting us in so many different and important ways, and it will affect how we eat. It will affect our food systems. It will affect the relationship between us, our health, and the way we eat. We need an ecologically safe operating space, as Rockström, a Swedish scientist, has said. There is an area of uncertainty, inevitably. The only thing that's certain is uncertainty. And we need to be sure that we keep enough safe operating space, enough ecologically safe operating space. We don't know how close to the edge we are. As we lose our ecosystems, we don't know when the tipping point will come. That's the point that's being made. How much is enough? We are too many and we use too much. Skidelsky and his son Skidelsky have written this wonderful book called How Much is Enough? And they've figured out through a number of studies that the basic goods that we need are health, security, respect, personality, harmony with nature, interestingly, friendship and leisure. And that's what we need. The thing is that with food, we need to understand when enough is enough. And we need to be more prudent and careful with what we've got. And I think this is another way of talking about livelihood, but it's a broader concept about the things we need that need to be universal, final, sui generis, which means that they are intrinsic to who we are and indispensable. What are those things? The United Nations system has put this together in the Sustainable Development Goals. And these are the 17 goals. And for the 15 years from 2015 to 2030, that's what we're aiming to do. So we have another 10 years to go to achieve these things. We had the period from 2000 to 2015 for the first set of goals, and this is the second set out to 2030. And we've all signed up to this. So where are we headed with human ecology and health? What we need to do is to act socio-ecologically, whether personally or professionally. We need to think and plan intergenerationally between generations and for our children and grandchildren, to gain access to open and natural spaces and gardens, and consider when enough is enough, and emphasize livelihoods over important. So with that, I would like to conclude and thank you for the opportunity of me sharing with you the way I presently understand the relationships between food and health. Thank you very much. We are socio-ecological creatures who need to... Thank you.